Okay, so John Locke believed we have this blank slate and stuff is added to it, and then we can make decisions. But a contemporary of him was George Berkeley. And George Berkeley was actually an Anglican bishop, and his little jingle was to be is to be perceived. And in other words, only what is under our perception is real. You've heard the saying out of sight, out of mind. Well, Berkeley would take another step and say out of mind, out of reality. And the critics of this theory were like, oh, come on, we know plenty of stuff must be there even if we can't see it. Like maybe I'm watching a river flow by, but I can only see 100 yards of the river. But I know it's just not starting 100 yards up and ending 100 yards past me. It's coming from somewhere and it's going from somewhere. I mean, but see, I'm using my reason, not my direct sense experience for that. It's because of what I've learned about rivers in the past that I'm applying to this situation. And Berkeley's response to that was, oh, you egocentric humans. Everything isn't dependent on your perspective. It is for your reality. What you perceive is your reality, but the cosmos is dependent on God's perceiving it. And God is perceiving everything all the time. And that's why it exists. There's one thing God doesn't perceive of, though, from a Christian perspective. What's that? Our sin.
Hmm.
If you are in Christ, how about that? So Berkeley, it was very, I think he was very clever. He was using empiricism, saying only what we perceive is real, where people were trying to say we can't perceive God, so he must not be real. And he kind of flipped it on its head and made God dependent for everything in the universe that we can't observe, but know must be there, like the dark side of the moon that we don't get to see. But we have pretty good reason to believe there is another side of the moon. If you ever get an email or correspondence from me, that's my sign off. Perception equals reality. And that will be a big theme when we get to the existentialist later on. If we get there tonight, better pick up the pace. Okay. Ooh, and then we get down into Jung, and I'm going to save him for later. And then the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, and I'll also talk about him later when we talk about the existentialist. Okay, so the Age of Reason in the 17th through 19th centuries, a lot of people began to think in terms of a mechanistic universe. And a lot of this had to do with Copernicus, who was in the medieval time period. If you remember, his claim to fame was he presented the idea of a heliocentric universe, that everything was orbiting around the sun, not Earth, which many people had thought previous to that. We had Galileo, who was worked with optics and was able to make a telescope, and he saw one of the moons of Jupiter. And this caused such a sensation because when they saw that Jupiter had moons, it implied that that moon was not orbiting around Earth, it was orbiting around Jupiter. And maybe other things aren't orbiting around Earth. And that began the shift, at least for Europe, into a heliocentric understanding of the universe. We already mentioned Descartes, but him along with others, I believe Newton was actually a watchmaker. And they started to look at the cosmos like a giant clock. And that became the model within the mind. And a reductionist is someone who believes we can reduce all phenomena down to a naturalistic, materialistic explanation. We don't need anything besides physicality to explain everything from love to particles at the far end of the galaxy. We can use matter and nature to explain everything. And with this view, it leads to what's called a materialistic determinism. Does anyone know what materialistic determinism is? I'll give you a hint. It's the naturalistic equivalent to religious predestinationism. So both spiritualists or Christians can believe in predestination or determinism, and so can people that only believe in a physical material universe. And that's what a materialistic determinist is. They see it almost like pool balls or dominoes, and as atoms hit and collide, it creates reactions throughout the universe, and we are just one of countless reactions that are happening. But it means we don't have free will, we don't have volition, we're just atoms being knocked around into other atoms throughout space-time continuum. Any questions on that? It's a kind of a very dark view. There's no freedom, there's no choice, there's none of that. We are just victims of matter playing out. The major 19th century philosophic influences on psychology were Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. At least those are the three I'm going to highlight tonight. And Schopenhauer he was trying to find, like many philosophers, the underlying source of reality. I love the analogy of it's like Dorothy peeking behind the curtain to see who the wizard is or what the wizard is. And that's kind of what philosophy is about. We're trying to peek behind the curtain to see what's going on back there that's manifesting into this world that we're of observances. And in the medieval period, people believed God was what was behind the curtain. And we were veiled kind of for our own protection because his glory was so great. If we peeked at what was running it all, we would be consumed by God's glory. So God has this kind of veiled from his presence and glory. In the rationalist, the modern philosophic view with Rene Descartes, when he pulled back the question, he just saw like a big question mark because he believed in radical doubt. And kind of like Socrates before him, he was trying to figure out what can we actually know that wasn't taught to us or is just hearsay, but what can we actually know? And I think we discussed what he finally came up with was we can know that we are thinking things. As long as we're thinking, we're a thinking thing that exists. But if you stop thinking, you don't even know that anymore. Okay. When Schopenhauer pulled back the veil, what he saw was sex and violence. He believed that was the underlying motivators of all human behavior. And now we're starting to get into Freud, right? To a degree, when we talk about the id and what's going down below the surface, but below our conscious minds, we have all these primordial urges of reproduction and power and control and violence. And it's so fascinating to me. When I first read that, I was just like, wow, Schopenhauer, that was very insightful, at least when you look at culture. Think how much sex and violence sells in our culture. And whether that's a football game where you've got the smash mouth football and then it pans to the beer commercials with babes and all of that, and then it's back to the smash mouth or the cheerleaders, and it's like back and forth. And if you look at a lot of the Lifetime movies or horror movies or music or songs, they are full of sex and violence in our culture. He's also been accused of being a misogynist. He had some rough views on women. But I think for Schopenhauer, the main thing I want you to think about is this idea. He began discussions on the will and how each human being has a will to power.